Inbibitor Lunae Dan Heng is a hungry boy. He's also the newest Destruction Imaginary damage carry that we got a little tease of last patch with the story, and has become the new leader in damage with quite a few cons to offset that power. To be completely honest, he's not going to be for everybody, nor is he a character that you can just drag and drop into an existing team and expect for it to feel good. That's something that I'll get into in more detail later, but if you're watching this before pulling, keep that in mind when watching because his skill point management problems really are a problem. So with that less than cheery disclaimer out of the way, let's see what he actually does. Dan Heng's skill Drakor Libre is the crux of his kit and the hardest thing to manage. It doesn't consume any points when cast, but instead puts him in a buffing state where you can consume up to 3 skill points to enhance his next basic attack. Consuming 1 skill point turns his basic attack into Transcendence, a 3-hit single target attack that does a decent amount of damage. Consuming 2 skill points turns his basic attack into Divine Spear, a 5-hit single target attack that also hits the 2 adjacent targets for the last 2 hits. And consuming 3 skill points turns his basic attack into Fulgurant Leap, a 7-hit single target attack that also hits the 2 adjacent targets for the last 4 hits. In addition to that, when you use Divine Spear or Fulgurant Leap, Dan Heng gains a stack of Outroar from the 4th hit onward. So in Divine Spear's case, you gain 2 stacks and Fulgurant Leap gives you 4 stacks. This has a max of 4 stacks and increases his crit damage by 12% per stack, totaling 48%. The skill does a lot, so the easiest way to think of it is that more points spent equals more damage. Because his skill enhances his basic attack, Dan Heng cannot generate skill points, just like the other characters we have that enhance their basic attacks. Unlike them though, Dan Heng is also using far more than they are each turn, because you want to be using the strongest attack that you can afford. Because of this, skill point management with Dan Heng is extremely important. But there is one way that we can mitigate how many skill points that we consume without losing damage. Dan Heng's ultimate, Azur's Aqua Ablutzal, is a 3-hit attack that does a very high amount of damage to a single target and high damage to 2 adjacent targets. It also grants 2 stacks of Squama Sacrosancta, which you can hold up to 3 of that act as skill points. The idea with Dan Heng is that you want to be using Fulgurant Leap as often as you can by using Squama Sacrosancta. Next, Dan Heng's talent Righteous Heart grants 1 stack of Righteous Heart after every hit unleashed during an attack. Each stack gives him 10% damage, and you can have up to 6 stacks that last until the end of his turn. Fulgurant Leap is already an extremely hard-hitting skill, and with this, the last hit from it does an extra 60% damage, with each hit leading up to that doing more and more damage. The last thing I want to bring up is his technique, Heaven Quelling Prismodraken, because when you enter combat with the buff, he starts the fight off with 1 Squama Sacrosancta already. Having that 1 extra point reduction can really help in getting those early buffs and debuffs out before using Fulgurant Leap. Moving on to his traces, I'll be honest, they're pretty unimpressive. His first major trace gives him 15 energy at the start of a battle. His second major trace gives him a 35% chance to resist crowd control, which you don't see that often on a damage carry. And his last major trace gives him 24% crit damage against enemies that are weak to imaginary. The first 2 can be delayed until you get the last one. After you get the 3rd major trace, pick up the energy gain trace, and lastly, the crowd control resist one. For your skill leveling priority, his basic attack beats everything and should be the first thing that you max. Everything else is around equal in value, and you can level them up in any order you want or keep them all at the same level. Personally, I would level his talent first, then his ultimate, and then his skill. Having the extra damage from his talent is going to help just how hard Fulgurant Leap hits. Now, this brings us to his Eidolons. Like most characters, Dan Heng is perfectly good at E0 and is going to take you through all the content the game has to offer now and in the future. I would never recommend spending money to pull for copies, especially if you can't comfortably afford it. Dan Heng's E1 increases the max Righteous Heart stacks he gains by 4 and grants 1 additional stack per hit. As a refresher, this is from his talent where each hit from his attacks grants a stacking 10% buff per hit. E1 makes the max damage increase 100% and you gain 2 of them at a time, buffing not just the overall damage, but how quickly it ramps up as well. E2 advances his turn 100% after using his ultimate and makes his ultimate give 3 stacks of Squama instead of 2. As usual, E3 and E5 grant +2 to his skill, talent, and ultimate, and +1 to his basic attack. His E4 makes Outroar last until the end of his next turn. And lastly, E6 makes it so that when an ally uses their ultimate, the next Fulgurant Leap gains 20% imaginary penetration, stacking up to 3 times. If you're going to be pulling for Eidolons, I would stop at E2. The extra Squama you gain on ultimate and the turn advancement are big, both in terms of point management and burst damage. Now that we know what he does, let's take a look at the sets you want to be using on him. 4-piece Wastelander of Banditry Desert is going to be his best in slot, followed by 4-piece Musketeer, and then 2-piece Wastelander and 2-piece Musketeer. For your planar ornaments, Rudolanta Arena is his best in slot, followed by Space Sealing Station. Now, let's see what stats you want to be finding on those pieces. For your chest piece, you're going to want either crit rate or crit damage, whichever you need more. For your boots, you'll want either attack percent or speed. For your sphere, you'll want imaginary damage. And for your link rope, you'll want attack percent. For substats, Dan Heng is going to want to follow a pretty standard priority like this. Something to keep in mind when finding gear is that you're going to want less speed than some other damage carries. Because of how many skill points he uses, you need time before his next turn to get those points back. If the team that you're using needs to use skill points periodically, making sure that they're significantly faster than he is becomes even more important. I would still aim for 120 to 134 speed since we're not trying to build him like a total slug. And if you're doing Memory of Chaos, we still want him to get turns in, but make sure the rest of your supports are at least 140 plus so they get their turns in. For his light cones, these are the ones you want to use. Not only does Brighter Than the Sun provide 18% crit rate and a stacking 18% attack buff, but it also gives him 12% energy regeneration at max stacks. The extra energy regeneration really helps over longer fights by letting him get out more ultimates and gaining more squama. While it's not a solution to his skill point management problem, it makes it just a little bit easier to do. The unreachable side, unfortunately, requires him to be hit for the damage buff and increases his max HP, which he doesn't really need. But the high base attack and crit chance can sort of make up for that, especially when you're using Rudolent Arena and need to reach the 70% crit chance requirement. Without having a light cone that provides crit rate, you're going to have a significantly harder time hitting that threshold. On the Fall of an Aeon actually ends up being a pretty tempting light cone though. It's got a lower base chance than the other 5-star options because it's from the Herta store, but the stacking attack buff is huge, and Fulgurant Leap has, I believe, the highest toughness break in the game, letting him actually take advantage of the secondary effect a lot more than other Destruction Path characters. The last thing I want to go over are his team comps. Because of his point-hungry kit, you need to run him with a very point-efficient team. A standard Dan Heng team is going to look something like this. Locha is going to be the best defensive support that you can use. Because all his healing is coming from auto-activation of his skill and his area effect, he's completely 100% point positive. Pela also doesn't ever need to use her skill unless you need to dispel something, and Tingyun only uses her skill every few turns. If you don't have Locha, you can swap him out for any defensive support that you have. Japard would actually be a really solid choice as an alternative because all his support comes from his ultimate. While you can use other damage supports, both Tingyun and Pela are going to be the most point efficient that you can use. Bronya, on the other hand, is not going to work very well. She provides a huge amount of damage, but especially if you pair her with somebody else that uses points, you're going to be very point starved, and in some cases might have to delay using Fulgurant Leap because of it, which you don't want to do. If you're going to be using Bronya though, you can play with her the same way that you would with Pela, where instead of using her skill, you only basic attack with her. Between her basic attack having guaranteed crit, her stacking crit damage, and her buffing the entire team's attack and crit damage, her damage contribution is still going to be really strong. She also has the added benefit of still being able to use her skill when you know you're going to have enough points for Fulgurant Leap, further buffing damage. It's a bit of a change in how you'd normally use her, and I would still rather have Pela personally, but again, if Bronya is someone that you've already got built, then this is how you're going to want to use her. No matter what supports you bring with him though, I would keep Tingyun. Because the Squamma Sacrosancta are the main way that he can manage points, being able to use his ultimate more often during the fight is going to both allow greater flexibility in who the other supports are and make managing skill points significantly easier. For full auto players, I really hate to say it, but as someone that plays full auto a lot, there's only so much that can be done about point management. Tingyun is going to help a lot since they changed her AI to only use her skill when she needs to, but everyone else unfortunately is going to spam their skill as much as they can. In short fights, this doesn't really matter, but as soon as you do anything that's even remotely long, it's not worth doing. If you're going to be playing Dan Heng, I would strongly recommend at least doing bosses manually. Dan Heng is a strong damage carry, but he's not overpowered or broken. Because of the skill point cost, he's a lot more balanced than he appears when you're watching clips or running content with him. He's also just straight up harder to play than anything else. If you're somebody that really likes to optimize your gameplay and try out different character rotations and speed tuning, then you're going to like Dan Heng and how hard he is. For everyone else, there are better damage carries out there that are easier to play and more full auto friendly. With that said, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of him, or if you're pulling for him at all. Take care of yourselves, and good luck on your pulls.